the Philadelphia Eagles, who won the Super Bowl this year, best wide receiver, this man named A.J. Brown, was caught on the sidelines reading a book in the middle of scored a touchdown, went back to the sidelines, sat on the bench, was reading a book. And cameras caught it. He was asked about it in a press conference, and he said, it helps me kind of get grounded and go back to making sure that my mindset is right.
Welcome to the Bounce Back Generation podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer Dillon. Mental health in sports has become a really important and public topic these days. Someone is looking into that, and that's Michael Pedicano. And he has dedicated over 15 years to building brands, some of the most iconic brands from MTV to Bleacher Report. And now he's looking at this really interesting intersection between sports and intellectual growth. He has a new media brand that he's called Up From Here, and they have a newsletter called The Bounce Back. No relation to Bounce Back Generation. We're definitely friends. And he joined me to talk about some of the great icons. He's going to talk about Michael Jordan, Naomi Osaka, Messi, A.J. Brown, Kobe Bryant. He comes with a whole bunch of really great stories about how they have learned how to manage their mind so that they could be great. Michael, thank you for being here. Talk about your Bounce Back project.
Yeah, sure. Happy to. So at the start of the new year, I began to write about moments in sports that I think are most notorious for being lowlights for some of the most famous and most accomplished athletes the world's ever seen. Michael Jordan, Serena Williams, Messi. It's a who's who of people who've achieved things that you and I, and really even the most casual sports fan, would look at and go, holy smokes. And what I've done is take a look at the moments that maybe we don't think about when we think about their careers, because they are about missed shots, about turnovers, about failures to win, and use that as a framework to explore what we can learn about our own journey and situation and how to maybe bounce back. I'm happy to dig into greater detail.
I'm not a sports person, but, there are some sports stories that kind of break through the people who are paying attention to sports.
Sure.
And some of the ones that have broken through to me recently have been where the athlete has pulled back from their career and said, I'm taking time off because of my mental health. Being a really great athlete and knowing themselves enough to be able to say, I got to step back because of my mental health. And then how that gets perceived by the public who, is rooting for them or thinks that, hey, you're the people that are making me look good because I'm following you and I'm, you're my idol, my icon or whatever.
Yep. I think a few things. So famously, I think Simone Biles pulled out of the Olympics in 2020. Naomi Osaka, just to give the audience some context of some of the names that we might be talking about, very famously and very bravely made decisions to kind of take a step back, as you said. I think one of the biggest things is it's generational, right? I think we live in very strange times. I think one of the things that's nice about 2025 is it does seem like we are in a better place in talking about mental health and some of the things that were super taboo. I mean, I've seen a therapist since I was a kid. But I remember 12 years old now. This is the early 90s. And it just being weird, right? That was not a thing kids did in the early 90s. Now, I think it's pretty standard for those of us that are fortunate enough to have an infrastructure to see a mental health specialist. So I think there's a lot more sensitivity to it now. And I think at the end of the day, it goes back to that humanization thing of you're of no value to anyone, yourself, your team, your sponsors, your fans, if you can't be right for yourself.
Yeah, I definitely think Gen Z and even younger are much more attuned to how do I feel? How do I emotionally feel about this? And also I think there's just a heightened sensitivity to anxiety because they live in just this soup of anxious producing stuff that's in our world, and it's pretty bad. So that's a lot of what we try to teach at Bounce Back Generation is how to, first of all, recognize that it's not your fault. You've got genetics, you've got your nervous system, you have, all of the stuff that's coming at you. We weren't built for this kind of stress. We were built to kind of run away from a tiger. Right. And, and one thing I think that I see with athletes that people I don't think talk enough about. They'll talk about like the mental game, like,
Mm-hmm.
you got to be tough and go back
Mm-hmm.
in there. And, about a year ago, I interviewed a physiologist, a doctor of
Uh-huh.
physiology, and he was a football player in college. And
Mm-hmm.
he talks so much about how much the mental game was important
Mm-hmm.
to him. He's like, I can work out, I can, get big muscles, I can look tough on the field. But if I'm if I'm just like mentally talking negatively to myself, I'm losing the game. I've already
Mm-hmm.
lost it,
Yep.
So I think there's like, I see it as like you have your physical body that you're building up, right? And you have your
Mm-hmm.
natural talents, and then you have your brain, which is different than your emotions. So do you
Mm-hmm.
get into any of that?
Mm-hmm.
Like how, maybe if you've observed or you've talked to anyone who's talked about that balance, that mental, emotional, physical balance that you have to have in order to be a really good athlete.
So as a quick anecdote, or maybe like a proof point that would be interesting to you and to your audience is the Philadelphia Eagles, who won the Super Bowl this year. During their playoff run, their best wide receiver, this man named AJ Brown, was caught on the sidelines reading a book in the middle of like scored a touchdown, went back to the sidelines, sat on the bench, and was reading a book. And cameras caught it, and when the cameras caught him, they of course he was asked about it in a press conference, and he said it helps me kind of get grounded and go back to making sure that my mindset is right as I like move through the game, which I thought was super interesting, just as like a what an incredible tactic in such chaos to know like this is where I have to go to make sure I stay where I need to stay to perform. So I think increasingly athletes themselves are deploying these types of resources and how they go about what they do because everything is optimized now, right? Like that's the other big difference. It's like everything is studied, everything is quantified. There's a specialist in everything. I think for me, and more germane to the newsletter and the work that I do, last week I wrote about Sha'Carri Richardson, who's a track runner. She tested positive for marijuana, which is legal in Oregon, but disqualified her from participating in the Olympics in 2021. She remained her authentic self when she kind of made her return and explored some things like the spotlight effect, right? Which is like the idea that everybody is always looking at you. We tend to have this perspective of like it's very self-centered when the reality is like we're all thinking about ourselves basically all the time, right? But we can kind of compound or overestimate the attention on this. It's called the spotlight effect. Um, Today I wrote about Chris Webber, and I'm sorry to bore you as not a sports fan, but Chris Webber was a very, very talented basketball player in the early 90s and was part of a team called the Fab Five, which was kind of this culturally impactful team of freshmen who all started together at the University of Michigan. And in 1993, in the national championship game, he called a timeout, which he didn't have. His team didn't have one. And that resulted in a technical foul. His team essentially lost the game as a result of this. Very, very devastating on national television. He got a handwritten letter from President Clinton kind of telling him, hey, chin up. And where I'm going with this, though, is like I use that as a way to explore what's called counterfactual thinking, which is like how we deal with mistakes and this like doom loop we can get caught up in of how we relive these things that we've done that we wish we hadn't. And we engage with them in a way that creates this doom loop of kind of self-loathing and self-doubt in our heads. I say all this to say to your question is like I have tried to make things that we all deal with accessible. I think like a lot of the experiences are deeply relatable, but we don't have the words to put to them or the frameworks to make sense of them. And that I think has been for me the most helpful in speaking to people who read it and people in my circle of like, oh man, I didn't know there was a term for this, or I didn't know this was such a universal thing.
That's fascinating. And then Chris Webber, who
Yes.
called the timeout. So
Yes.
did anyone talk to him and say, how did you get over that? I mean, just like this universal like spotlight on you. Everybody
Yep.
saw you mess up.
Yep.
The president had to write a letter to you to make you feel
Yeah.
better. I mean,
Yeah. Well, it's funny because he was wild, couple things. Wildly talented. Like he was their best player. Somebody who's he's an NBA Hall of Fame. So to be clear, he graduates college or he leaves early. He goes to the NBA, and he's a Hall of Fame talent. This isn't just some guy. This is somebody who's at the best of the best level. He didn't talk about it for a very long time. He talked about it in the press conference afterwards, and was very, straightforward of like, I didn't know, I called the timeout, I screwed up. But the type of, I think, public genuflection you'd hope for took decades. It was like a long time. And then he finally published a book and then was willing to talk about it. And he named his nonprofit, like his charitable organization after, I think it's called the Timeout, but basically owned it and has realized, and that was kind of the theme of today's newsletter, of like, not every mistake actually needs to be redeemed. I think the other thing where this blends with like just general storytelling and how we take in movies and books and everything else is it's got to be neat and tidy, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes like we screw up and it becomes a part of who we are, and as long as it doesn't define us, it informs better choices and smarter living going forward. Then like, again, that's just the human experience, I think.
A lot of my experience with sports is watching my son play sports and really like wanting to do well in sport. And I'm just going to universalize this. It's not about him, but I just saw, I saw a lot of kids who played, they touch football or baseball or basketball. And for a lot of kids, there's such a drive. They really, really want to do well. They want to live up to what they see their idols doing, like I can dunk and I'm going to beat, this person. And there's the competitive stuff, but there's also the drive to just be seen, just to be recognized. I'm good at something.
Yeah.
And then, you can see it happening on the field where they're out there playing and they mess up. And just immediately that sense of doom comes over them. Their whole body kind of, slumps over, or you can almost hear their internal, self-talk. God, you suck, or they say it out loud just because they want everyone to know, yes, I know I suck. Like, don't say anything because I'm going to beat you to it. Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's really fascinating to me is how do you get through those moments so that you can continue to play and not allow them to be that, it's that first block is that moment when you're playing and you're really young and you do something wrong or you can't, you're not the best on the team. And there's so many athletes that I think were not the best when they started out. So what kept them going past that horrible feeling of shame or humiliation or, embarrassment?
I think sports history is littered with the stories of like, Michael Jordan didn't make his high school basketball team, right? I think it's like maybe the most famous anecdote of like,
Really?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. I take these things for granted because my whole life has been sports. But Michael Jordan grew up in North Carolina before going to the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and at Laney High School. I think his sophomore year, he got cut from the team. He didn't make it. Now I think that summer he grew something like 8 inches, and it was a very different story coming back. But not everyone, even that achieves the highest levels, were on the fast track the whole way, including what's considered to be the greatest basketball player of all time. I think youth sports, it's toxic and concerning. I think the pressure from parents has become too much. I think it's ironically part of the reason I launched the Bounce Back and have ambitions for broader exploration in and around sports is because I think as it's become such a large part of popular culture, as it's become monetized the way that it has, we've actually lost sight of like what it means to us in terms of as a society, as a tool for developing socialization and self-confidence in kids. I have a 9 and a 7-year-old, and both play sports. One is a fencer, one is more of a field sport. It's individual and team, and so I'm getting like the whole thing, and it is a tough environment. What I will tell you about the self-talk thing, though, there was a clip not too long ago of Cristiano Ronaldo, the best soccer player in the world ever, up for debate. But the point is like, this is the top of the heap. And he's talking to himself on the pitch, reminding himself that he can do it, that he's good, that he's talented. It reminds me of you remember the old Stuart Smalley SNL sketches where
I'm good enough.
I'm smart enough.
Smart enough. People like me.
It's such a classic. And of course, like there's the one with Michael Jordan where I don't know if you've seen it, but Michael Jordan's trying not to laugh through the whole thing because the whole premise is like, hey, it's okay to be just a guy. You don't have to be the best. And Jordan is trying not to laugh the whole time that Stuart Smalley is doing this.
All I have to do is be the best Michael I can be.
All I have to do is be the best Michael I can be.
Because I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and doggone it, people like me.
because I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and doggone it, people like me.
But Cristiano Ronaldo is doing this on the pitch. He's saying, like, you got it. It's going to be, everything's good. And I think that's important. And that's one of the things with my kids now in everything. Self-talk is like words we say to ourselves are impossibly powerful. And that's like the first thing I say to my kids. So I say 4 things to my kids when they leave in the morning. Same thing every day. Believe in yourself, do your best, be kind, and have fun. That's it. If you do those 4 things, that's not like rules for school, it's rules for life. But the first one is believe in yourself. And I'm not a coach. I don't normally talk in coach speak, but I actually think if you can teach your kids anything, it's that positive self-talk and self-belief. But that's a war that we all have to fight, especially like the anxious among us and self-loathing among us, which I count myself among, all the day, just like yaps at you.
It's interesting because the self-talk is we have a 4-step way to get yourself to hack your brain and body when you're highly stressed out.
Okay.
The first thing you got to do is breathe.
Mm-hmm.
Breathing sends a message from your brain to your body to start unwinding from the fight or flight.
Okay.
And the fight or flight is, I'm sure athletes experience this too. And sometimes you can use that adrenaline rush, but sometimes it can throw you off because it's an automatic response. It's not something you're in charge of necessarily.
Yep.
So first breathe, that sends a message to calm your body down. Next is move your body so that you start getting some of that energy out. That's the fight or flight. And then the next thing is you have to talk to yourself because your brain is a pattern making machine, and you start talking like you suck, you're terrible, you should quit, everyone hates you, all of that. You've got to turn that around and reset your brain. And then the 4th thing we say is you got to do meditation and mindfulness, because then you notice that the thoughts that come into your head are not yours. You can swipe them away and move on. And meditation shows you that you become the observer instead of the victim of your thoughts. Yeah. Our mutual friend, King.
Yes.
I was texting him this morning, and he sent me, I was like, I don't know anything about sports. Like, what do you think? And he mentioned, and I don't think he put the guy's name in here. A college basketball player missed an important free throw in an important game that his team ended up losing. It was a devastating moment. I think it ended their season. They lost rather than going to overtime, maybe. Anyway, at some point, maybe during the off season, maybe as the next season was starting, a reporter asked him if that moment haunted him or whatever. And he was kind of genuinely surprised at the question. He said something like, I already forgotten about it by the time I walked off the court.
Yep.
Do you know what that story might be?
I do. That's a short memory is something that is, they say, especially for usually relief pitchers, guys who are in a position to give up a home run, the game's over, and you got to walk off the field. And in the NFL, defensive backs, guys who give up a touchdown, is like everyone's got to have a short memory, and you got to wipe it away basically the moment after it happens. So that's I think most successful people in almost anything, not just sports, like that takes a lot of mastery, but you got to be able to say like, no, it doesn't matter. Right. And that's kind of insane, right? Like, I'm sure you have moments in your life as well where you're like, oh, I mean, this goes back to the like counterfactual thinking and mistakes of just this idea of like, you can't change it. You can't renegotiate it. Right. And that is like seems to be a hallmark of anybody who's good at anything needs to be able to say like, next, like, just kind of is what it is. Right.
That's a trick though. That's a tool that you have to practice, because I think, I don't want to kind of elevate a moment of losing a game to PTSD, but there's an element to that especially if you do something that's especially bad, you really, or it's like the last free throw and you miss it or whatever, where you become the center of the attention and the reason why we lost, and then it can feel like, I want to be able to let it go. But every time I wake up in the morning, the first thing I think of is how I messed up and how embarrassing that was. And then it becomes part of who you are. Yeah. And all you want to do is run away from that. And I think that's kind of that element of that, starting in Little League, that can be the thing. And then you're like, I'm not an athlete and I have to go do something else because it was so embarrassing. I wonder what you think of the role of coaches. I mean, and parents too, to help somebody get through that feeling and be able to let it go.
I think what's hardest about it is, I imagine, it's funny. I've told my, one of the things I've tried to do with my kids is tell stories of my own, like, things growing up. So for most of us, our parents are like 10 feet tall and bulletproof, right? So when they are going through things, I tell them, like, oh, here's the time I failed this test. Or
Mhm.
I mean, I remember in seventh grade, like missing a layup that cost my team a game in like a YMCA league. Like, you couldn't talk about lower stakes. I still can like picture it in my head, right? Like, it stayed with me. And this was not, everybody went home and probably had like juice boxes and moved on with their lives. But that's not a luxury that pro athletes have. I think the hardest part is it's really your teammates, right? I think that's in those scenarios, if you have built a culture around being on a team, you accept that you are as good or as bad as the best or worst person in your best or worst moment, right? And I think for people who have experienced the type of devastation that you're describing, the like haunting comes from feeling like you let other people down, right? But almost paradoxically, they're the ones that are most willing to accept it, right? Because they've bought in on you and being there and who you are. But I think actually the beauty of sports is the idea that, like, when you're at your highest highs, your lowest lows, when you're in it with a team, that's the lesson. That's how you move through things. It's like, we only got as far as we did because of the fact that we all needed each other to get here. I'm encouraging everybody. If I'm going to show the newsletter here, but one of the things we talked about is, like, the movie Groundhog Day with
Mhm.
Bill Murray, of like, that's what happens is, you, to your point about like the mind will start to create patterns, is like, you have to be able to break the pattern of living in the thing that makes you feel that stress, especially when it was self-imposed, right? Like, there's all sides of trauma that we all unfortunately have to go through. But when it's of our own creation, um, there is something to a degree in that's empowering, right? If we've screwed up because of something, a shot we missed, a test we didn't study for, or whatever it is, um, the burden is yours to carry alone, but you also have the freedom to distance yourself from it, I think, in a way that's especially unique than something like a PTSD or things where it's like, that trauma is so nuanced and chaotic and externally driven. I don't know if that answer makes sense, but I'm going to
Yeah, no,
pause there.
I think that's really good. And I think there's, you talk about teams. I think the team dynamic is really important. You don't always get, I think you get more of that in the professional
Yes. Yes.
level, where I think
100%.
over time, if you're going to be professional, you're going to have to learn how to be a good teammate, because you're just going
Yep.
to bring down your team, or you're not going to even get to that level because you're just going to be a problem.
Yep.
But I think for younger athletes, you're playing at, high school or even junior high school level, or even college level, lower level college level, you might get that team, or that one guy or two guys on the team or
Yep.
girls on the team who are just really obnoxious, and
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
you're making us lose, and what's wrong with you,
Mm-hmm.
why are you on this team,
Yep.
and that's of course devastating. It's that whole thing of, the classic metaphor of just standing there when you're little and waiting for someone
Mm-hmm.
to pick you on the team.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
it's very hard to even get over that. It's just
Yes.
because they're so deeply ingrained, wanting to belong, wanting to be okay with everybody. So I think while the team dynamic can be really supportive, at lower level play, it can be the source of the most pain.
Yeah. The responsibility of coaching used to be, hey, this is a pick and roll, or this is how you run this route, or this is how. And now it does feel like there is an emotional commitment to doing that, even if it's a town recreation league for fourth grade and fifth grade boys, right? My son's basketball team lost in the playoffs last year, and we had kids cry, right? And it's a little bit different than what you're alluding to from the perspective of the alienation that they can experience through error or poor performance, and how that can permeate their life in school and elsewhere. But I think in general, we all have a duty, I think, to be a little more thoughtful in how we engage with young athletes at all levels and in all contexts. One last recommendation. So I was at a newsletter conference 2 weeks ago, and I happened, like, the universe conspires to bring people together. I believe that. I sat next to a man who, like, was a theater guy. He, like, grew up in the theater. That was his joy. But he had a son who's like a great athlete. Plays basketball now at Mississippi Valley State, which is like high level basketball. But he didn't know how to raise his son to be the type of athlete that could withstand kind of the things that you're referring to. And he wrote a book on it, and I bought it. It's on my nightstand, and I'm going to send you the link.
Yeah.
But it speaks to a lot of these things that, like, you know, we are raising kids and athletes and adults all at once, right? Like there's this coalescence of things that we are trying to manage. And it's just hard. I wish I could answer for you. Like, here's what you do, Jennifer. It's like no one has the answer. But if you're going to coach or raise an athlete at any age, at any level, know that like table stakes is teaching them how to dribble, and table stakes is teaching them how to shoot or run or pass. You better be prepared to teach them sportsmanship and self-confidence and resiliency and all these other things, which like brings it back to like why I think sports is so awesome, is because like, you know, almost everything you need to be a good person can be found in sports if it's conditioned and nurtured within you in the right way. It's the best of us, but unfortunately it can also be the worst of us.
You know, in a lot of ways, I can look at sports like we use the hero's journey a lot to talk about like how you're getting through life, right? And the hero's journey, we kind of break down these kind of 6 steps that happen in a hero's journey. And the first thing that happens is your origin story. And in your origin story, if you look at any superhero movie, the origin story is always something horribly traumatic. You know, your planet blows up and you're sent off into space. You watch your parents get shot by a criminal. You know, it's horrible stuff. Or you bit by a spider and then your aunt and uncle die. I think if you look at sports from the perspective of a heroic journey, I think that might help a lot of young athletes who are kind of struggling through to see that process as heroic. And there's a lot of archetypes beyond are kind of embedded in the hero's journey that help. And, you know, I think about that, like, I do watch sometimes like skiing, like, which is not you know, a lot of the ski stuff is not team based. It's like, it's all on this one girl who's going to, you know, who's like been skiing since she was able to stand. And now this is the big moment. And, you know, something, you know, it's that classic, you know, agony of defeat moment, you know, on the ski slope or whatever, or on the jump. And the hero's journey offers a lot of ways to look at that downfall, you know. What did you learn from it? Did you bring it on yourself somehow? And if so, what was that quality about yourself that brought it on, that is screaming at you to notice it, because it is such a deep and important, you know, barrier in your life.
Wait, hold on. Can we pause? Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you. That's so interesting that you phrase it that way. So the idea that this moment that calls our downfall is actually like a deep manifestation of something that requires your attention, and the only way for it to garner the attention it deserves is to have manifested in this moment. Am I understanding? That's really powerful. Like, what an interesting frame. Don't know that I've ever considered that. And I think that's really interesting. And I can't wait to stare at my ceiling tonight and think about that in 1,000 ways. Sorry, continue. I just am I hearing that right? That's so interesting.
Well, I work a lot with archetypes, and because they offer these kind of very deep insights, and that is one of the archetypal hero's journey. You leave home and you do something really difficult in order to meet yourself in the tragedy that happens to you. And that you built that tragedy. It's part of who you are, and you will never realize it until you face up to it in that moment in that clash, right? And so that is one way of looking at it. There's another way of looking at the hero's journey and seeing that failure is the teaching moment. It is the next step to true greatness. Because I think for a lot of athletes that can be true, where they were the best kid in their class, you know, and then the best in their school, and then the best in their division, the best in the state. Then they got to the Olympics, or they got to the big team, and suddenly they are not the best. And then they have to learn from others. I did watch a interview with Michael Jordan, to talk about Michael Jordan again. And man, that guy talked himself to greatness.
Yes.
Because he did have failures, and you could just see how he has honed that capacity in himself to say, I'm the best, I'm the best, I'm the best, I'm the best, no matter what. And I
Yes.
think, what's the other guy that's the big basketball player right now?
Well, is it LeBron?
I'm so lame.
It's okay. Like, is it LeBron James? Is
LeBron
it?
James.
Yeah.
LeBron
Okay.
James, same thing. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm the best, I'm the best. I mean, they like to a way that if I said it to myself, I would be embarrassed.
Oh,
Like,
it's
they don't
that
feel that.
it's so funny to me. I think Kobe Bryant, the late great Kobe Bryant, was like, I felt like the kind of paradigm for this of just like such a deeply held and profound self-belief of his ability that was like astounding as someone who like struggles with imposter syndrome and all these things. To hear him speak is like, where I can't even relate to that level of self-confidence. Like it's like an alien is speaking to me. But you're right, it is something that they, even if it is innate, they have nurtured and watered and groomed every step of the way.
I see it like the same way that they, stood in the basketball court, dribbling a ball and
Yep.
doing that 50 billion times, to
Yep.
get it right. They did the same thing in their head. And every time a negative connotation for what was happening, but they're also realistic. Like it wasn't
Mm-hmm.
like I'm perfect all the time. It was
Mm-hmm.
more like I'm not perfect all the time, but I learn and I grow and I get better. And I
Yep.
see the weakness in my enemies and I see the weakness in myself and I go in and I work it and I fix it and now I'm better. And
Yep.
I think
Yep.
that's like that winning thing. So I think we've identified a couple of things. One is the capacity to forget, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Which can be, some of us have it. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I just have a bad memory. Like if somebody told
Yep.
me that they did something nasty to me 10 years
Yep.
ago, I'd be like, really?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
No, I
Yep.
don't remember.
Yeah.
But some people don't, and that might be the thing they have to work on is how do I forget it? And then two, I
Can I
think like
actually? I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
yeah.
I'm sorry. I don't want to. I feel like you were bullet pointing some of our takeaways, but I'm wondering if it's worth considering. Like, I don't think any of us forget. I'm wondering if we just radically accept, right? Like, I don't. You know what I mean? Like,
Mm-hmm.
I like. There's a like laundry list of things in my life that I am not proud of that are mistakes. Like, I'll never forget. I'm gonna be, God willing, a 90-year-old man, and I'll still tell you about that layup I missed. But what I've done is accepted that they were part of this hero's journey to the extent that I'm the hero of my own story. And through radical acceptance, you can achieve the same outcomes, perhaps even more valuable outcomes than forgetting outright. You know what I mean? It's not like amnesia so much as just a reconciliation. Does
So
that make
what do you
sense?
do with that? Do you like put it in a drawer in the back of your head and close the drawer, throw away the key? Do you make it part of who you are and say, yeah, I am capable of that and I'm also capable? I mean, like walk
I,
me through a process.
that for me, like at a personal, like deeply personal level, I
Yeah.
think, it's funny because this has all become so meta because it's so much why I started this newsletter and this brand is because I think separated from sports, I think at like a social human level, we too often walk around with this sense of like, we all want to be liked, we all want to belong. And so the stories we curate for people are always like the glossy ones and the highlights. But we all have the things that are messy and we're not so proud of. And so, one, that is, I think, the tie that binds. Two, I actually think that's more interesting. Like I was thinking the other day about, this is true of any trophy, but I was thinking about the Heisman Trophy. So the Heisman Trophy goes to the best college football player every year. It's very prestigious. It's very well known. But I was thinking about how like everybody gets the same trophy. If you've won the Heisman Trophy, it looks the same. The one you get and the one I get, it's all the same trophy, right? And so what's actually more interesting is like, what's the story that got you there? Because at the end of the day, if your trophy case is the same as everybody else's, then like it's not that interesting. And then the last thing I'll say about it before I think maybe I'll answer your question more directly is someone recently introduced me to this idea of like, there's the two stories, and there's the like, this goes back to kind of curating how we show up in the world, but there's the story of like, I've been a pretty successful person professionally, right? And I don't need like laundry list or resume, but like I've achieved some things, made some decent money, like life's been pretty good. And I could tell that story and say, here's all the things I've done, and leave a room being like, man, that guy's pretty awesome. Or I could tell you about like the times I got kicked out of college for not going to class, or run-ins with the law, or times I wasn't a great like brother, son, like that story exists too. And in no way does it take away from the positive things that I've done, nor does it do the positive things I've done excuse. It's just who I am,
Hmm.
like, and I think that's the part is, I think, more directly to your question about putting it in a drawer, is like, you just have to understand that it's all interconnected, and you're never as bad as your worst moments, and you're probably never as good as your best moments. You're just human. My coping mechanism to reframe this whole conversation is really just to have said, you know what, this is me, this is my shit, this is my mess, and these are my trophies, and like, they go together, they sit in the same room, right? One doesn't sit at the kids table and one doesn't go, and it, like, this is it. Because the alternative, to try to like be perfectionist, which is like deeply problematic. We don't need to unpack that here, but like the unhealthiness of perfectionism is like it's a problem. Or we live in shame, right? That's the other thing, is we walk around feeling like we carry this boulder full of stuff. And so any alternatives I may have explored in my own life, or how I process the human experience, hasn't worked. And so all I can do is say, here's my shit, and here's the things I'm super proud of and are probably pretty impressive, and here's the things that are like huge bummer, and hopefully they are valuable to you as someone who may be going through something similar.
Well, it makes you interesting. I mean, I have never read a story where everything went perfectly for the person. Maybe that's an interesting idea, is to write a story where everything goes really well. I don't think anyone would buy it. It'd be boring. If like
Correct.
I just, have magically be able to make everything work my way, and I never get embarrassed, I never fail, I never have a moment of doubt.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I think we don't recognize is how much, really the most successful athletes are the ones that are subject to the most intense hatred, criticism, and focus. And I
Yep.
don't know how they play. I mean, I would just be, frozen in I'd be like, my nervous system would be going off all over the place if I knew I was, playing in a place where everybody hates me. If I make a mistake, everybody is constantly saying shit to you, and how can you not get distracted by that? So, any stories you could tell about how athletes deal with that kind of thing?
It's funny. So Leo Messi, who's like, an all-time soccer great, playing for the Argentinian national team. And obviously, like, when you're talking about like South America and soccer, football, and in that country, and the amount of national pride, it's hard to even relate to in America. Honestly, like, we don't really even have anything that matches that type of passion and intensity. And they were in an international tournament, and he missed a shot and he quit. Like, it was all too much for him, and eventually would come back. But the thing that stood out to me in that was that, like, everyone hears it, right? There, no one's above it, and the weight can be too much for anyone, right? This is the best soccer player ever. And said, I
Mhm.
tried. Like, and if you, go back and read some of the stuff that he said and that I wrote about, it's just like, I gave it my best. It's not meant to be. And like, I'm done. I'm finished. And that is a very, unfortunately, like, reality of the times we live in, is now everyone gets a voice. That, like, not everybody's supposed to get a voice. Speaks to a little bit what you said earlier of like, we are not wired for this place and time, actually. Like,
Mhm.
biologically, our entire makeup is at odds from the, like, physiologically and biologically, with the world we live in. They are contradictory. And I saw something the other day about uh, online harassment experienced by college athletes as a result of betting outcomes, is like this new thing. Now that people can bet on games, and kid misses a shot and the team doesn't cover, and so and so at the bar lost $50. So I think, for me, I do have to like self-select what I consume and where I choose to engage. Like, I think that the best advice I can give to folks that feel like there is a cacophony of noise created externally by social media, or so, whatever it is, it's like, you got to tune it out. And I don't mean tune it out
Mhm.
like be so stoic that you ignore it. I mean literally, like, don't go on social media, right? I know to certain generations are like, what are you talking about here? I have not yet figured out a way in my own brain or life to regulate those things, other than just to say, like, they're not for me. Can't,
Mhm.
like, and I know it's not intended as a political discussion, but there are many of us for whom the news cycle is a tough watch these days. I think I'm not alone in saying, like, I've had to figure out how I manage the tap of information that I'm comfortable with to feel like a responsible and engaged citizen without allowing myself to drown in despair or any of the other number of things that we might experience when we ingest too much. The thing that has informed so much of the way I see the world is in self-awareness. Like, I actually think that's the thing, is like, just figure out what works for you and who you are and what you believe, and then calibrate to those things. That's going to be your best compass. And then the things that you gather along the way, whether it's like movies you see, books you read, art you take in, athletes, you're like kind of building a patchwork of like, I like this, I don't like this works, this doesn't work, because there's no blueprint for all of us, right? There's no playbook.
I mean, you said it. You have to start with knowing yourself. You have to spend the time to really understand yourself and what works for you, what doesn't. And like you said, I always say we're operating with a 1.0 system in a 5.0 world.
Yes. Yep.
And by the way, if you're interested, we've done several podcasts about how young people, but everybody is trying to process, and everything from Gaza to the political situation. I mean, all of this comes in and it affects us.
Yeah.
And to pretend like it doesn't, and just because you've seen it through a screen, that's how we get our emotional triggers, is through screens now. So it's extremely important.
Yep.
So one more question before we wrap it up.
Please.
Which is about, we connect as fans. And you talked a little bit about this. There are some countries where the entire country shuts down if they lose.
Yeah.
And the entire country shuts down in parties if they win. I mean, and you can really see, like, there's depression will set in if their soccer team loses or something.
Yep.
What do you say about the attitude of fans in losing?
Man, I went to college at the University of Texas, and football in Texas is near as close to like soccer in many international countries. Like, it's a borderline religion. And I am one of these people that when my team loses, I'm a tough hang, man. It affects my mood for sure.
Why?
I think
you have to explain it to me, because I don't get it. I've never felt that way.
Yeah, I don't. Well, you know what? As I've gotten older and had kids, I think I've gained a little more perspective of like, well, everyone's healthy and there's money in the bank. I guess we're fine. I think we see sports and teams in colleges and universities. This is especially true. Is like, that's our tribe, right? Like, that's the banner under which to put it in like militaristic terms, wrongly so, but it's the only thing I can kind of latch onto, is like, this is our tribe, right? These are our people. They represent us. And when they win, we win. And then when they lose, we lose, right? I think it's a little bit about like kind of a projected self-identity, right? And we could probably talk about like tribalism and all these things ad nauseum about sports. Like anything else, there's a healthy and unhealthy way to deal with these things, and a healthy and unhealthy way to let it bring joy into your life. But I think like anything else we're seeing now is like, there's good actors and bad actors, right? There are people who riot when their team loses. There are people that riot when their team wins, which has always been weird to me. It's like, we're going to, light couches in the streets because the team won. You're like, that's not supposed to happen when you guys win. Sports to me have always been, they're important because everything in my life, in terms of my relationship with my family, I have 2 older brothers and my father, bonded over sports from when I was really young. So, at a young age, for me, there was a very like traditional, through like the lens of traditional gender roles, like male bonding experience around sports in my home and how I spent time with the men who mattered to me. And then similarly, as someone who like wasn't a world-class athlete, but like played all through childhood and into high school, my best friends were the kids that like on Saturday afternoons, we ran around the park playing football together before like we discovered girls or got driver's licenses or had any, like, that's where the friendships were made, was in like the gyms and ball fields of my youth. And so that's what sports has meant to me and why I do this now, right? Is because I like have always seen in it something more meaningful. And as I've gotten older, I've found the wisdom in it beyond just the like social connective tissue.
Thanks for listening and watching or tuning in to us. And I'm Jennifer Dillon from Bounce Back Generation. We're a nonprofit. Please check out our website at bbgtv.org. Leave us a comment if you have ever lost an athletic event, either personally or with a team, and it's affected you personally. And how did you develop your sense of bouncing back from that? We'd also like to hear you if you're someone who has the ability to be really confident in yourself all the time. Please share it, because it's something that a lot of us struggle with, imposter syndrome and doubting ourselves. Please don't forget to subscribe. If you'd like to donate, you can at our website, bbgtv.org/donate. Either way, we're really glad to have you here. And also check out our other podcast called It's Interesting You Say That, where I speak, I'm Gen X, I speak with a Gen Z man, or I'm a woman, and so we are a lot of opposites. I'm also a liberal. He voted for Trump. So we have really great conversations about what's going on in the world today, all from the perspective of how we build resilience, personal power, and bouncing back from the adversities that life throws at us. Thanks for being here.